October 2nd, and this working session of the State Board of Education will come to order. The roll call will now be called to determine the presence of a quorum. Mr. Hayward, please call the roll.
President, sorry, I don't normally do roll call during working session, so I forgot. It's all right. It is totally on your script. I apologize. Dr. Gasoy.
Present.
Mr. Jacobson.
Present.
President Wattenberg.
Present.
Dr. O'Leary.
Present.
Mr. Parker. Mr. Parker. Dr. Sutter.
Present.
Ms. Williams. Ms. Williams. Mr. Batchelor. Mr. Batchelor. Ms. McClay. Ms. McClay is on the phone. Mr. O'Sullivan. Ms. Burton.
Here.
Madam President, you have quorum.
Thanks. Do I need to acknowledge that Ashley's on the phone?
Yes,
Okay.
do that part of this script. Yes.
So, a quorum has been determined, and before the State Board proceeds with its agenda, I would ask unanimous consent that at-large Representative Ashley McClay can participate in the meeting by phone. Any objection? No. Seeing none, we'll continue with our agenda. Okay, so, I think we'll go straight to the science report, because all the folks from OSSE are here, and then we can come back and we're going to rejigger a couple things on the agenda. All right. Okay.
Okay. Well, we are really excited to be here with you again to talk a little bit more about the DC Science Assessment and our performance level setting process, and to present to you for the first time the proposed cut scores for the assessment for grades 5, grade 8, and high school biology. I am going to do a little less talking today because you didn't have a chance to speak with Daniel, our science assessment specialist, at the last working session. So he's going to lead this presentation, and I will join you again.
Just work it out.
It says it?
Yep.
Okay, sorry.
There you go.
Jay, do you want to?
Yes, good afternoon. Again, my name is Daniel Alcazar-Roman. I'm in the Office of Assessment, leading the DC Science Assessment Development. And also, we'll talk about the DLM assessment as well this evening. So our objectives are to give you an overview of the development of the assessment and the performance level setting, discuss some of the perspectives from educators that talked to you on the 18th, and then present the proposal for the CAT scores and next steps for approval for the CAT scores. Okay, so as a review, federal requirements for us are to adopt standards that are challenging for science. On the assessment front, we're required to have an assessment at grades 3 through 5, an assessment for grades 3 through 9, and one for 10 to 12 for science. This state also must have assurances that the standards are aligned, or the assessment is aligned to the standards. The assessment has to have at least 3 levels of achievement, and it also we must have an alternate version of the assessment for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. As far as reporting, we're asked to produce individual reports for parents and schools, and also to enable those reports to have be segregated into subgroups for the state, LEA, and school level. Okay, so our assessments we're talking about today, they're designed.
Question about
Yes.
the grades. Since we have middle schools, and the 9th grade is part of the high schools, is that a problem as far as like 6, 7, 8 as being a place where we would give an assessment, and then 9 through 12, probably not 12, but 9 through 11 would be a place where we would assess rather than, because you got 6 through 9, but they're in different buildings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so those are the requirements. We, as a community, are able to choose when we give that one assessment within that band.
So the federal government says you have to give it 6 through 9?
At least once in elementary school, once in middle school, and once in the high school band, including from 10th to 12th.
Yeah. So I think you're calling out something really interesting about the federal requirements, that they have 6 through 9, which you would normally see 6 through 8. And so after a lot of engagement with our educators about what was most appropriate, DC chose to assess in 8th grade for that one
No,
assessment
that's
during that
fine, I
band.
just think that it would be, just looking at this, it would, if it said 6 through 8 and then 9 through 12, then that would explain the way our system is set up, rather than,
That is the federal law.
It's a federal law, yeah.
And the federal law is a
But the
minimum
fed-
number of assessments, right? Not a maximum.
Minimum.
So if we wanted to have like high school growth, for instance, we could add an additional assessment.
Sure.
Okay.
but the federal law says 3 times, right?
It says once in each of those 3 bands, and it specifies the bands of 3 through 6,
So,
and 3 through 5, 6 through 9, 10 through 12.
okay.
And those are the bands they list. And if you're calling out kind of a weird distinction of that second band, that includes one of the high school years.
Okay, so we adopted as a district the next generation science standards. They are rigorous standards written for K through 12 science education. They have been adopted by many states, and they are based on what you'll see throughout presentations, a 3-dimensional approach to science education that includes scientific and engineering practices, scientific concepts, and cross-cutting concepts in order for students to be able to master science, in order to be prepared and be successful in college and in 21st century careers. In 2013-14, we adopted that here in the district, and that necessitated a new approach for teaching and new assessments to be developed for the general having a general assessment and an alternate assessment as well for students with the most cognitive disabilities. So we shared this with you last time. These are the stages that we followed to develop the assessment. We started with working with educators on the test design, which included when we wanted to have that assessment, what content to include in that assessment, what type, item types to include, how we wanted to ensure that the NGSS standards would be represented in the test. After that was concluded, we went on to start item development. After the items were developed and written, we convened panels of educators to workshop these items. That means that each item was brought to a panel, and we worked on modifying that item until it was acceptable, that it was aligned to the standards, and it was appropriate for the students, and the content was acceptable for the teachers. We did 2 rounds of that, and then we continued with releasing full-size practice tests for students to have a feel of what the test would look like, item types. It looks just like the actual assessment, and we released that in February, way ahead of the administration. We created the actual versions, we call them forms of the assessment. They went through editorial review, and we developed a suite of accommodations for students that require different versions of the test. Then we created an operational field test administration that happened about the same window as Spark, and that's what our students took in grade 5, grade 8 in biology. Then we had an event called range finding, in which we convened again educators to look at how students responded to the assessment and how those would be scored by live scorers. After that, we looked at the data, and we did a review looking at the items, how well they did. And from that, we formed the actual reporting versions of the assessment. We brought those versions to an event called performance level setting, in which the educators engaged, and we'll talk about this in a second, and gave a recommendation for CAT scores for the assessment. We're now bringing that to you here at the Board of Education for approval of the CAT scores, and we're hoping that we're able to report by mid-December And that's the deadline we have with the Department of Education.
I'd just like to say that, judging from the testimony at our last meeting, that I hope that the next time you all do a subject assessment for a different subject, that the excitement that the teachers gave us in the panel at our board meeting is the same for the other subjects. Because they were just, I mean, that was so impressive about how the teachers were just so excited about how the whole thing was set up.
Yeah. Okay, so just a little bit about the assessment structure. Our assessment is given at grades 5, 8, and high schools for biology students. Is designed as a cluster-based design. That means students are they're given the testing units. They're given 4 units. In each unit, they see 3 item clusters. So items are clustered in groups. So the items are in each cluster are designed around a phenomena, something interesting in nature or the design world, or a problem, an engineering problem that they're engaged then into items that walk through trying to understand the problem or understand the phenomena and answer some questions about that. So we give them stimulus. That means they have text, they have graphs, they have data, and they engage with that in order to respond to different tasks. We have different item types. We have selected response, multiple choice, and multiple select. We have technology enhanced items, which means students interact with different pictures, maybe words, and they move things around, sort. They create graphs or models. And also they have constructive response items where they have a space and they respond to different tasks. We have domains, so this is a little closer to reporting now. For grades 5 and 8, they will have domain indicators for physical science, life science, and earth and space science. And for biology, the domain is only life science. High school. Okay, so as I mentioned, educators engaged in a process called performance level setting. This is a process in which educators develop recommendations for CAS scores for each of the performance levels. For this assessment, we have 4 performance levels. So partially meets, approaches expectation, meets expectations, and exceeded expectations. So in performance level setting, as you can see, we have 4 levels of performance, and educators engage in looking at the standards of the student expectations. They look at the actual assessment that the students took, and they use their content expertise and the expertise with students and different students, a diversity of experiences of educators, to actually determine with all that expertise and information which are those CAD scores that lead students to be in different performance levels. You can see we have 4 levels, so we have 3 different CAD scores, and that's what we're going to bring to you. I'll show to you in a few minutes. So in order to get to this process, we develop performance level descriptors with teachers, and these outline specific expectations for student performance at each level. They describe how students perform within each level, and they show the progression of this 3-dimensional performance across the different levels. So these were developed for each of those NGSS performance expectations, and they also led to some bigger descriptions, and these are performance definitions of the policy level. And you can see the differences here in performance, starting with exceed expectations. The students here will show and demonstrate a thorough understanding, and they have sophisticated reasoning within the 3 dimensions of NGSS. Meets expectations, the students here, they have a substantial understanding, and they have relevant reasoning. They can use the 3 dimensions to respond to those tasks. Approaching expectations, the students have a basic understanding, and they draw connections between those dimensions. And that partially meets expectations, the students they have below basic understanding, and or they're just starting to make those connections between the dimensions of NGS. Okay, so this has some examples of items. So here we have multiple choice item that looks very similar to a regular older version of an assessment, but actually is written to a more rigorous level to match the expectations of the next generation science standards. We have an example of a technology enhanced item. In this one, students have to manipulate those two words, so we're called draggers, and they go into bays and spaces to complete those sentences. And here, students are making conclusions about some information. And then we have an open response, a constructive response item with 3 different bullets, in which students are engaging with the information we provide, and they're working through 3 different tasks.
And Daniel, remind people that these are the questions, but before this, there's the stimulus, right?
Yes. So before they get to actually 6 items, the students are presented with a phenomenon, something interesting in nature, or a problem, and then they're engaged into different items that usually follow a progression, and they start becoming a little more difficult as they go through the item cluster.
Yeah, as Daniel mentioned earlier, the items are designed with the scenario to really walk students through the problem solving. So they have an ability to start building knowledge over time and maybe asked to pull in more details as they go, in the way you would when you're dealing with a real problem or a real scenario.
Okay, and here we have an example of a grade 5 performance level descriptor. And we'll start here with level 2 approaching expectations. So here students use a small, simple data set to construct an argument that plants need water to grow, and that they take in water from soil through their roots. So students would be given some text, some pictures, and they use one of those to answer the item. A level 3 for the same performance level descriptors. Students will use 2 or more pieces of evidence. So now they're using the text, maybe, and a graph to construct an argument. And then here also you'll see that the verbs are a little higher, and students are supposed to do a little more. A level 4 exceed expectations. Again, they're using multiple now pieces of information. They're creating or refining an argument that's a little bit more difficult or challenging. And then the content gets a little bit harder. As you saw at the beginning, we talk about plants being able to absorb air through their leaves. Here, they're absorbing air not only through air, but in water if it's an aquatic plant.
So here you're getting to a lot of the rigor that the teacher panel was talking about 2 weeks ago. Is you got to know the science, you got to know the content, you got to know the lower blooms type stuff, but then you also have to combine data and information to make a higher level order argument.
And additionally, this is the information that the educators who are at performance level setting were grappling with when they were saying, if I believe a student is going to be in a level 3 category, they're just barely going to get in there, what does it mean they're able to do? Right, so really understand for every performance expectations, what does it mean to be in that level 4 category? What are the expectations? So there was a lot of really deep discussions about these performance level descriptors at the highest level, but also at the more granular level that you're seeing right here to help really set informed cut scores.
Okay. And we use this performance level descriptors also to develop items at different levels. So we are able to collect information the students are performing at different bands. All right, so we're going to shift a little bit to the dynamic learning maps, science alternate assessment. So we're required to have an assessment aligned to the next generation science standards, also for the small group of students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. So we have joined a consortium called DLM to implement this assessment. The consortium is facilitated by Accessible Teaching and Learning and Assessment System, Atlas, that is out of University of Kansas. We are a partner here, so we're involved in the design, development, and implementation of the assessment. And you can see a list of the participating states here. They also have opportunities for our teachers to be involved in the process of item writing, and the same cycle that we talked about, the general science, but in a consortium space. The DLM is built around multiple ways of students to demonstrate what they know and able to do in science. So during this administration, students have access to unique accessibility tools and supports to be able to gather information of what they know. So the decisions about the tools are dictated by the IEPs or 504 plans that students have.
So before we, Danielle, can you just give them a little bit of context of why we're in a consortium for the alternatives?
Absolutely, which is different from us building from scratch the DC Science Assessment. So much like Daniel talked about the multi-year kind of engagement process we had with educators on the DC Science Assessment, we did the same process for visioning around the alternate assessment with educators from different LEAs, and there was a lot of strong support for the work that had been happening with the Dynamic Learning Maps group. They thought that there was a lot of power in the intellectual capital of partnering with other states. We have a very small population of students with significant cognitive disabilities, and there's a lot of deep expertise that we can kind of learn from in a new way in partnering with the other states in this consortium. There's also, of course, the economies of scale and the ability to field test and all of the wonderful things that come with partnering with those states. We also have the kind of the ability at this stage to join when it was a really solid assessment that had been implemented really well over a number of years, which is something that people were also very interested in. And we have kind of, you dove right in, and our accessibility expert dove right into this partnership and have been able to really problem solve both with the really high quality vendor as well as some of our other state partners as well.
How do we deal with the alternative assessment as far as the star rating, as far as the schools being evaluated, as far as that? I know that where at the high school at Cardozo, we had a significant minority of students who had IEPs and would probably recognize as being taking the alternative assessment.
So most of our, so it's a good question. First, the science assessment is not included currently in the star rating, but maybe you're mentioning MSAA, our alternate assessment for English language arts and mathematics. It is actually for the students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. So it's a very small number of students with disabilities. The vast majority of our students with disabilities would take our general assessments with accommodations as appropriate in their IEP.
Okay, because it just mentions the IEP.
Sure.
And we had a significant number of students with IEPs.
Yeah.
But you're not talking about that group of students. You're talking about students who were severely...
Who have who have the most significant cognitive disabilities. And kind of, there's federal guidance on that you would estimate it to be about 1% of your population. We are a very small jurisdiction, so it kind of goes back and forth there, but it is a very small number. We have a couple schools that focus on that population, and then a handful of students in a couple schools.
But I'll
About
also
500
say
students.
that even though the number is small, in various ways we report the outcomes of it along with the regular tested the regular test.
Yeah.
So we'll include essentially in whatever counts as essentially like proficient and above, when we detail it in our data notes to show you where and where not that is happening. So in most cases, the 1% of students who are taking those are grouped in with the rest of students, where it says how many students who are taking it are meeting expectations and above. But there are more detailed notes about where and when that isn't happening in various kinds of reporting that we do. So it does get reported.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and that's important because both the Dynamic Learning Maps assessment and the MSAA assessment for English and math are built off of our content standards. So MSAA, multi-state alternate assessment for ELA and math, is built off of the Common Core State Standards in ELA and math, and the Dynamic Learning Maps assessment is built off of drawing essential elements from the Next Generation Science Standards. And they also, as Daniel's going to say, have expectations of performance. And there is a cut for what does it mean to meet the expectations. And we believe that is something that is critically important that those students are also included when it means they've met the expectations or they haven't.
Okay, so the DLM Science Assessment uses a learning map model in which science learning is divided into nodes, and those nodes show student progression over time in science. Here in the science learning maps, for this assessment, we call them essential elements, and they're aligned, written to the next generation science standards. Students in the report, in student reports for DLM, students have 4 performance levels. So we have emerging, approaching the target, at target, and advanced.
And because it's a consortium, and then it's an assessment that has been established, they set cut scores for this assessment a few years ago. And so what we're going to bring to you, when?
For 2017.
2017. And that is kind of part of, in partnership of this, the cut scores are something that the consortium has set. So when we actually show you the cut scores, you will see the cut scores we've been talking about, our development, our process for the DC Science Assessment, and then the consortium level cut scores for the Dynamic Learning Maps Assessment.
Okay. Okay, so as you mentioned, we all had the privilege to hear our educators last time we met at the board meeting, and here's some of the feedback that we just put on here in front of you. They talked about the next generation of science standards as setting a higher bar for science learning for our students, and that's something that our students deserve in all schools. So they also mentioned that transitioning to NGSS for science instruction has helped transform the way of teaching and learning for science. And then they mentioned that there's a great need for educators and for appreciation for science education, and that right now science may not be getting as much attention as the other subjects, and they were very passionate about that. Also, there's a need for better quality resources that align to standards and professional development. Okay, so we're going to now talk about the recommendations.
So you may have scanned the back of the PowerPoint already, but so just a reminder. I'm not going to go. Reminder on kind of how we got here. We're going to talk about DC Science first, and then go into dynamic learning maps, because it's a little more straightforward with dynamic learning maps. For the DC Science assessment, we talked a lot about the performance level setting process with our educators. We had our reasonableness review with our lead educators, who really talked about, as they're looking across, the expectations that we're setting and the standards and the rigor and the depth of understanding those performance level descriptors you saw and what that looks like in grade 5 versus grade 8 versus biology, and gave us a lot of information about where they believed these cut scores needed to be. We reviewed internally, and we are presenting to you today a proposal for the cut scores. So the DC Science Assessment has a scale of 300 to 600 and an anchor of 450 as meeting expectations. So what you're looking at here, it's an anchor across the board, which is something that we've done with the PARC assessments and a number of other assessments as well, which helps kind of anchor what does it mean to meet expectations, particularly for parents, and interpretive value. In grade 5, approaching expectations is at a 418. So what is the scale score? You're seeing scale scores right now on that scale of 300 to 600. What is the scale score point you need to get from a level 1 to a level 2? Borderline, just barely getting there. And that's a 418. What's the score that you need to just barely get into meeting expectation? That's the 450. It's anchor cut across. And for exceeding, 476. You can see in grade 8, a 409, 450, 484. Biology, 412, 450, 476. There are natural differences. There's some natural similarities as well, just based on the expectations set in the from the educators and the standards and where they thought that needed to be. This reflects their feedback. This reflects our from both of the multiple rounds of panel engagement, and we feel really confident as to where we are now. So, any questions about process, about what this means?
I have two questions. One of them has to do with the educator panel feedback.
Yeah.
Because not all the middle schools have, and elementary schools have science teachers. And that was one of the biggest problems that they talked about.
Sure.
Well, they're sharing science teachers, and I guess I want to ask Shauna if that's a conversation that's ongoing with OSSE and with the mayor's office about, and with the chancellor's office about schools that don't have, so they're not preparing the fifth graders if they don't have somebody in the building all the time.
Yeah. I mean, I think this data is going to certainly bring that conversation to the fore. I
Good.
think OSSE as the state, we're not in charge of hiring for schools.
Right.
But part of the reason we want to make sure that the assessment is there, the data is available, and that it's getting to parents and families as well as to the school leaders, is to have that conversation about what does this mean for our kids, and what would it take to improve our student learning in that space. And if there's a great way to do that with limited teachers, that's great too. If there's a great way, if we need more teachers, or as our teachers have said, they need improved access to resources or curricula that's aligned, that's a really important conversation to have, and we're definitely supportive of that. And that's what we're kind of hoping, that when we release this in December, that we can prompt that conversation.
I think that should be highlighted, that part right there, because that's very important. And for those super teachers that were talking to us, telling us that we've got one hand tied behind our back, or somebody does. It's not fair to the kids at all.
That's right. I think it's heartening that our teachers are also sort of feeling strongly that they're the ones to sort of hold the line on what it means to really know and be able to do these things according to what the standards say. They were, as you heard, they were not particularly interested in saying this is going to be good enough and it's fine.
No, not at all.
Not at all. And they, really obviously really believe in the value of the learning of science, and also in the new ways that next gen standards are helping kids do it, as opposed to just remembering the three phases of a bean or whatever, a cell, or the things. Clearly I did not get on the NGSS for a while, but you know what I mean. It's really about the same kind of critical thinking we talk about with social studies or with ELA or math, right? It's like, how do you take information in front of you and make it meaningful as a citizen and as a human in this world where we're required to do that every day? So they're not backing down on it.
Right. The other question I have is on page 4 about the performance definition, and it talks about a student that partially meets expectations. What is there something written into the structure so that those students who are, because we don't want them to be partially meeting anything.
Yeah.
What is what devices are in there to set those, not to set them aside, but to separate those students so that they can be pulled up, so that they can be exceeding expectations or meeting expectations? And is that something that y'all talked about? Because sometimes we don't think about. I mean, we talk about exceeding and we talk about meeting and stuff like that, but we don't think about those students that can't meet them right away, but can be taught to meet if they're given the.
So as part of the development, we are taking all the standards in NGSS and we're creating specific descriptors that help teachers understand what is it that my student needs to learn and be able to do to be become a level 2 student. Right. If it's already a level 2 student, how do I take him to level 3?
How do they figure that how the water goes up the plane?
Exactly. Yes, and so and those are very specific and very fast, and each one, as we said, they're 3-dimensional. So we have a statement that says this is where your student needs to get to, and this is what it means for each of those dimensions.
Right.
And we actually asked the educators, it's really granular stuff, and we said, do you think this is worth having it be part of our development process, that the educators who are in the development are working with our vendor and working with us? And they said, no, release it publicly, and we're going to, which is looking at every single performance expectation and splitting it down to the multiple levels, as opposed to what you typically see, which is, and we're not yet there, we haven't finished them all, but what you typically see and what we're going to release with this first release is the high-level performance level descriptors, which is what we see for all of our assessments. But this isn't saying every single performance expectation. What are those specific kind of ways to build, to your point, that start with this description of a level 2 student? So what does it mean to get to each place?
And another thing that's important is like how you drive students from partially meets to meets to exceeds is reviewing student work. I mean, looking at student work, thinking about the breakdown of knowledge, thinking about did they only use this graph, did they only use that graph, did they piece those things together, and how do you give them work that improves their specific skill, right? I think that's what's going to set this assessment aside. It's not just like true or false. The nucleus is the powerhouse of a cell.
Just trying to show you remember.
We're past that. And they're
Thanks, Jay.
they're complicated too.
So I have 2 questions as well. The cut scores are for the assessment overall.
Yeah.
But then you mentioned these domains. Will the domains be simply on the student-by-student score report? So like Jessica scored, X in life sciences, but this in the physical sciences, or will that also be broken down by a school?
You can, so we will be able to share that across school levels as well as individual students. They're categorically done, much like Park. So level 1, 2, 3, we don't show the 1, 2, 3 except in the data file. So we will have a similar view, and we were able to do that, which we were really excited that we had enough score points to be able to actually get down to that level. But we'll look at multiple levels, so not just at the individual student level.
So that the teachers can also then understand like where students are lacking knowledge as they prepare for the next. The second question is about sort of public rollout of this and sharing this with the broader public, because I had a parent get our agenda tonight and private message me and say, when is this assessment being delivered? Is it being delivered on computers? And I had to say to her, it was delivered already. Your child took this because she has a 5th grader. Like your kid took this exam, and this will be the first time the scores are released. But so I think there seems to be at least some lacking of public knowledge of the fact that this is the first time the assessment in this format is being shared, that the scores were determined in conjunction with the teachers based on the cut scores. So is there a plan for public information campaign / can I strongly encourage such a campaign if one is not in the works?
So we're certainly working on, we're just trying to get scores done. But
Sure.
No. But
What do you mean? You haven't done it all at once?
working on that, working on getting scores finalized. We are certainly working with the communications team on what does public rollout mean. We do a lot of engagement with LEAs, LEA assessment managers, and some individual school assessment managers pending the LEA. But we don't always know if it trickles down, right?
Yeah.
So we will certainly take that note. I think it's really important. We really strongly believe in the power of shining a light on performance and talking about standards and talking about expectations and where we are and where we want to be.
Sure. Sorry.
I was just going to say, Danielle, there's going to be individual student score reports that will also go to the school.
Yes.
So I think this is another area that we can really use y'all's advocacy, which is making parents aware that the schools have them in cases in which the schools are not perhaps as proactive or prompt at delivering them, or that they have logistical considerations with getting them out. We encourage with Park parents to be aware that they should be receiving their score reports from the schools, and every so often we hear, unfortunately, that they didn't get them in a timely way, and so we also like to ask you, and once we have a date that they're out, we will, as we get closer to when these are out in December, we'll have more reporting to you when the scores come out, but at that time we'll also ask if you can also spread the word to constituents as well.
So you can get us like a thing that we can stick in our newsletter.
Yeah, and we'll get you some social media stuff, and we'll get you some dates and times and talking points too.
The only other thing I wanted to mention as well is that Quinn and Dr. said this was before you joined the board, so when we discussed the accountability plan as well, it was part of some of that discussion as well. That DC Science as being part of the process. So there was some public outreach at that point, but that was
Yeah.
yeah.
Quick question. Accommodations that are allowed, for instance, for students who may not be strong readers but would score well for math. I mean, I guess it would apply for math too.
Yeah.
Like for science.
What do we do?
knowledge. Yeah. Do schools/teachers have discretion in terms of accommodating or?
So we have an accommodations manual, and this is my former background, so I'm deeply passionate about it. We have an accommodations manual for all of our assessments. It's all in one place. And we try to align to the extent possible the science accommodations with parks, so students are getting a very similar feel to the extent possible when we were doing it all ourselves this time. But in that situation, we actually have text-to-speech for the science assessment, and it is not an accommodation. It is an accessibility feature. So if you're a student who, because we believe that while the ELA standards are a part of it, for construct relevance, it is something where you can have it read aloud to you and still demonstrate your knowledge and skills in science. And so that was a big push we made for Park Mathematics, and we did that for science as well. There are a suite of accommodations, things like Braille. We have Spanish assessment, Spanish online, Spanish paper for our English learners. We have human reader accommodation script if needed. That's a very rare case for kids with disabilities. We also have a suite of embedded accessibility features like color contrast and answer masking and a magnifier. And so I think we're lucky with the platform we have that it does have a suite of accommodations and accessibility features that we keep building every year.
Thank you.
And we do an analysis at the end of each administration of usage, or at least assignment. We can't always tell usage because people turn things on and off, and kids can just do that. But we can look at assignment, and we do track that over time.
I have a few short ones.
Yep.
So on the slide about the assessment structure, it says in grades 5 and 8, the assessment is in physical science, life science, earth and space science. And then it says biology, life science. Does that mean that the high school test is biology/life science?
Yeah, so all the biology student expectations standards are all in the life science domain.
The biology standards just happen to all be in the life science domain, in the agenda.
So in grade 5 and 8, they have life science and earth science and physical science, but biology, all the questions, all the items are in the life science because it's biology. The biology course.
So the high school exam is a biology test?
Yes,
okay,
exactly.
All right, got it.
And the NGS's writers did a crosswalk for biology to ensure that every state had an understanding of what those standards were that tied to a biology course, because the NGS's aren't written that way. They're written in the domains of life science, so they helped us make a crosswalk to know what biology standards fit in.
Because we have a biology requirement. That doesn't, okay. And then,
And many states do.
Yeah, and so in grades 5 and 8, it's the whole variety of different sciences are being assessed, and do they align like from 5 to 8 in theory? I realize it's 3 different grades, but could you say do growth or align from those 2 grades?
So at this stage, because of the gap years, we cannot do something. I can't say I have every model of growth at this stage, but a student growth percentile, you can have 1 gap year and not 2. So we cannot measure growth from 5 to 8. We'd have to have a deeper conversation with our psychometricians about that. If you had a science assessment like 5 to 6, and students were walking that same assessment path, you could conceivably do it SGP, something like that. But there are many different things out there.
And then each assessment is assessing, in theory, all the 3 years worth of content?
Yeah, in grade 5 is the assessment at grade 5 is grade 3, 4, and 5 from NGSS. At the middle school, NGSS is written for the middle school, so it's not by grade level. So we are assessing middle school standards at the grade 8.
And then the question, we asked this of the teacher panel to some extent, and to some extent they could answer for their school or their LEA, but so my question to you guys is, can you give us any sort of landscape across the city, across the LEAs, about the extent to which schools or LEAs are using curricula that are well aligned to this, that actually put time into these subjects in all grades, not just 5 to 8? I mean, how and I hear you that by putting this out there, it will increase attention to that.
Sure.
I totally get that. I'm totally supportive of it, and I get that. That said, how do we know where people are?
Yeah.
What kind of efforts or the LEAs are you making to make sure that schools and teachers and classes can get up to where they need to be to do well?
I can only speak from the assessment side of the shop. You know, obviously there's a teaching and learning element. There's a lot of strong district control over that, LEA control over kind of how they're incentivizing science. But for us, it's about the type of engagement we've done around standards and around performance expectations we view that as a coaching, piece where we're kind of working with each other to clarify expectations. When it comes to what people are actually then implementing and doing, that may differ, but I think our expectation is that we're trying to set clear expectations up front and hope that that is something that is
Will you
particularly
make any recommendations, for example, of a variety of curricula that might help kids meet these standards as opposed to curricula that wouldn't?
Yeah, I mean, we would like to be in that place at OSSE. We are not there right now with the depth and level of knowledge of the curricula available. I think it's something if LEs also ask for it. We've thought about this also in ELA and math. Also, it's like on the agenda of a place we want to get to, but we're not there yet. I think we will certainly be doing some at least cursory work to look at where other states are doing this, both with assessment and otherwise, and making resources available. But I don't think we're going to be at the position of like a hard recommendation, probably. But we'd like to be getting there over time. And there are definitely other states that either have like a much tighter grip or more sophisticated sort of curricula, sort of like communities of practice across bigger states. We don't have that right now, but we'll definitely be taking this and using it toward that end. And also, interested in gathering a little bit more from LEAs to learn about what they are doing or what they're not doing. If anyone has a comprehensive way of looking at it, we'd be happy to sort of convene that and bring that to y'all's and other people's attention.
Sort of going to the next step. Can you tell us anything about how you were saying that in other states the community practices may be more advanced, but what about the assessment itself? Can you tell us anything about how ours compares to assessments elsewhere? And also, I'm just curious, you talked about why it was useful to be in a consortium for the alternative.
Sure.
I'm just curious
what's going on with
how
that.
you talked yourselves through why we're doing our own test here, what other states are out there that
It's a pretty easy answer to why we didn't join. Like, one is that there's non-existent really, and so I think that's just the reality. They don't exist, and part of it's about like the philosophy of the NGSS, and do you believe that you're going to measure all 3 dimensions of standards? There are some states that are not there yet, and don't commit to it because it's really hard to write to. There are some states that want to do multiple choice, single standalone items, and don't want to do that cluster model. There are, however, some really good and interesting models of science assessments out there. Daniel, you've done a ton of research into that. We have a pretty similar philosophy and design to Maryland. We're not working with them right now, but we have worked closely with them in many other capacities, and we've talked a lot about design with them. We can't say we are comparable. We've not done comparability studies, and we have a slightly different design, but we share a lot of similar principles.
So
Washington,
we have had when we were doing the design, we consulted with the Council of Science State Supervisors, with SCAT as a group of states that get together to discuss assessment design. There was a report by the National Academies Press about how to address NGSS assessment that we took a really close look at with national experts. We have the person that's the author of that report is on our technical advisory committee.
Jim Pellegrino.
And we're following the model that's being prescribed from NGSS. So the way we're creating clusters, the way we're engaging with the 3 dimensions of NGSS, being true to standards, that's all that is that as a collective thinking, and it's well published, and we've been following that.
Now, let me ask you a technical question. So you have prepared a resolution for us that sort of has the warehouses and then asks us to resolve in favor of this set of performance levels. Now, am I right that if we wanted to address some of these contextual issues, like the need of schools to have curriculum, and I'm not saying we do, but that would not interfere with your need for the resolution on the performance. So we have that freedom if we wanted to make those points.
Yeah, this is just on the consequently the achievement levels.
But I mean, we could add whereases to the same resolution.
Oh,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
purely
Yeah.
for your consideration.
That's your advice to the superintendent.
I have a question about curriculum. With the largest LEA being DCPS, is there a problem with finding texts and things through DCPS as far as following these guidelines?
I don't have a particular insight as to the curriculum. I personally just don't know right now. We can find out or ask them to share what curricula they
I'm
use
just
for
wondering
their
if
science.
there has to be, if there's I mean, I know that all these textbook companies are sending $1,000 books to people so that they can pick them up or whatever, and there must be an aligned or several aligned texts that follow all of these standards and things like that, so that each school would be able to have those texts in the building.
I would say like the textbook transition to the new assessment, the new standards, has been challenging. At least I am not as familiar with the kind of quality of curricular materials for the NGSS from the textbook perspective, as opposed to from the kind of more interactive perspective. But with the Common Core implementation, there were a lot of textbook authors very ready to stamp Common Core approved when they may not have been. So it's culling through that. That is very challenging. There's also just different visions for different LEAs and what they believe is quality. So I think
I mean, when you're talking about LEAs, what I was talking about, the largest LEA.
Oh, from ECS's perspective?
There must be somebody who has a job to look at text down there to see if they could. I was just wondering if.
I know that educators that came mentioned
No,
that they adopted an online resource, and they're starting implementation.
An online resource, but that's for schools that have online resources.
I think the educators mentioned that there's a wide implementation in DCPS.
Do you understand what I mean? I mean, there's a lot.
Exactly.
And that was the same problem with Park. You had to have a computer.
Yeah, I do not know. I know DCPS has done a lot of really well-regarded curriculum design internally also that is not necessarily procured.
Yeah.
So I would assume, and it compiled a variety of like internally developed and externally developed resources, but I just don't know enough to speak to it. Yeah, sorry. No, yeah.
Oh, sorry, you go ahead.
Do you know how like in depth the schools, or at least like DCPS, like the description of the curriculum and like these exams? Do you know like what they're being told? Is it more descriptive than just like domains like physical science, life science?
Yeah. You didn't know you could speak that, but yes, in terms of kind of what the amount we're sharing with schools.
So early in the process, once we had an idea of the design, we created some blueprint documents that discuss how the assessment addresses the standards and how many questions per domain and what types of questions, and how long the assessment is, what kind of things to expect out of that assessment. Then we release full-size practice tests that are available that mirror exactly how the operational assessment looks like. And we would like every teacher and every student have experienced that, but so new assessment, I think people are more aware now of what resources we have. We're releasing a lot more resources with the reporting that really describe how each of those levels of achievement should look like for students. So we have different resources to help teachers and students and parents understand the assessment.
And I know we've been looking at the screen for DC Science because these are the cut scores that we developed, but we also wanted to share, because it is part of the resolution, the cut scores that are part of the consortium level for dynamic learning maps. And they look really different. Why do they look different? It's a very, very different style of assessment. It is not scale scores. So these are not scale scores. These are linkage level cut scores. And so, Dan, I don't know if you want to say anything about the linkage levels, because it's a different type of assessment.
Yeah, so in this assessment, they assign a score for each level of performance. So each essential element, that's what they call, they consider the alternate standards they have. Each one of those has 3 levels, and each of those levels is worth 1 cut score point. And their model of analyzing the data is such that the scores are actually, if you see a 9, that means the student was able to answer for 3 different essential elements up to 3 points, for example. Or it could be if they have a possible number of 24 points, then out of that 9 is approaching 15 is that target, and 22 is that.
And what's helpful with DLM is they have a lot of supporting resources to help explain this to parents as well. So we'll have those associated resources. A student is not, if they take dynamic learning maps, they will be taking MSAA, so they will be having kind of 2 different resources to help them explain, but again, they're not comparing against DC Science, because a student wouldn't be taking the general assessment and the alternate assessment. You would always be taking the alternate, or you would always be taking the general. One thing I just want.
When you say explain to parents, what do you mean?
We have parent guides to student score reports that give a little more information about how you understand the numbers.
Just for the numbers?
So that plus associated resources or trainings that schools give, or back to school nights. So it's kind of all embedded in the way in which people kind of engage with parents. But we do kind of share language to support that.
Okay.
One thing I just wanted to highlight about the range here, we were intentional about the scale of 300 to 600 because it did not conflict with any other scales, right? The Park scale is 650 to 850, so it does not conflict with this. MSA scale is very different, and of course, SAT scales and things like that are different.
So you want them to be different so people don't assume they measure the same thing?
Yep, intentionally different. Because there are different policy claims for Park, right? We say things like, you are on track or ready for college and careers, which had data studies, external validity studies to demonstrate if that was a claim we could make. We are not yet there here. We're talking about expectations of meeting expectations of the standards for that grade band, which is different. So we thought it was important that people had a unique place, but similar language about performance levels, right? So you can kind of, if you're a parent and you're thinking about my child met expectations over here and met expectations over here, I can look at what that means, but I have a general sense, but I don't want to confuse the numbers being the same because they're measuring different things on different scales with different amount of points.
Okay. Anybody else?
So quick, just FYI, next steps, you'll see us. Oh, sorry. I don't know if it is. Yep.
Process.
Yes, process.
Yes.
We'll see you at the public public
Yeah,
session on the 23rd. Where review the resolution as you write it, change it, amend it, and our request would be passage of that, and the next steps from there would be, once approved, we use those scores to process and establish the performance levels, and then be ready to report in December. At the time at which we're ready to report, we generally provide you guys briefings on those results as well, and we'll give you more detail about those rollouts, the rollout and timing, and briefings that we will be providing you.
And the score will be on the report card, so.
Yes,
Yes.
the
It will be on the
score and
report
the scores will be on schools' report cards. I believe that they will be on in the winter. They may not be out at the exact same time, depending on when we can get them.
Yeah, depending
But
on
they will be
how
out
we go.
this winter on the report card.
But maybe not when the report card gets initially. If
Correct. It may be like a month or two later, depending on when we can get this done. And similarly to other assessments, we anticipated the scores coming earlier in future years, because the first year always takes the longest as we're doing this process. And so in the
Have they
future,
taken this test?
yes.
That's right.
Oh, so that was a pilot last spring?
It's
Operational.
operational field tests. So both.
Yeah. Yeah, so
So
it's
this will
a,
be publicly available and it will be published on every school's report card, but it does not count for accountability purposes this year.
Yes.
Or in any future point yet.
Yeah.
There's no plan for it to be.
Correct.
It might be
In
the
STAR
state,
report.
but there's not. No
Yes, but it is absolutely public on every school's report card in that same interface.
and we will similarly share data files in the way that we normally do with our assessment reporting, which is in a little bit of a different space. Like it's a little more granular.
Just as a devil's advocate, if a school doesn't have that science teacher full-time or even part-time, does that show up on the report card?
As of right now, it does not, no.
Has that been discussed?
It
You
has
understand
not-
what I mean?
Yes, it has not been discussed, in terms of, right now, that is not one of the educator, pieces of information that we show on the report card.
I will say, I raised at the public meeting that there have been a lot of discussion in the past about trying to have the report cards include for the elementary schools, of course, the schedule. And if we did something like that, that would be a time you could include in that is their science teacher. So, maybe something to.
It gets complicated from there on, but
Yeah.
it's not there now.
I'd say too, I mean, just in my own visits to schools in my ward, the varied arrangements that schools have created to teach science and social studies, I imagine would be difficult to capture succinctly on a report card. So one school I visited has a science teacher who teaches everybody in 1st through 5th grade, but pre-K and kindergarten have it taught in their self-contained classrooms in one school. In another school, every homeroom teacher teaches science, but the students are departmentalized for English language arts and math beginning in 1st grade. Again, pre-K and kindergarten do all this. So like, how would I describe that to the public in a succinct way, knowing that for the 13 elementary schools in Ward 6, there are probably 13 different versions of how science is staffed, and then we'd go to the charters. And then we'd have to have like all of their descriptions. I understand the desire for it, but I do think it would be hard to do so in a way that was consistent.
I guess that's my question, is the consistency part. Because it needs to be consistent.
Right.
Because it's not fair to those students that don't have.
Yeah. And yet within one LEA, it is my experience, at least within Ward 6, that it is not consistent. The DC public schools, elementary schools, have various configurations of how they're staffing and addressing science, and then the charters all have their own ways of doing it.
Right.
This is an interesting future discussion.
And I do think the publication of scores is going to help prompt an interest in public discussion of the topic.
No, I agree with what Shannon was saying, because it needs to get out there.
All right, guys. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you, guys.
We are gonna move through some of this, and I'm gonna flip around the schedule and do the teacher attrition report first. You said the teacher. That's your. All right. John Paul, you're reporting on that?
Sure. So, members, in your packets is the embargoed version of the teacher retention report. As is our typical practice, we have sent the embargoed copy to DCPS and PCSB for comment, which we will add as an appendix to the report. We have, feel free to review it. I believe you also have it in your emails, which we have sent it to you for you to take a look at. We're not going to talk specifically about the data in it today, but Alex has prepared a fact sheet for you with some of the basic information. You are welcome to take that with you. We prefer that you leave the paper copies here, but if you'd like to take one, let us know so that we can keep a little bit of version control of the paper copies. Yes?
What did you say was being added as an addendum?
If we get a response from PCSB and DCPS. DCPS has already presented, has sent as of this morning a response that I actually haven't even had a chance to really look at yet. But it is, we include those word for word with their letterhead on it. We don't touch them or anything like that. So what the next steps on the attrition report will be for the board to take a look at this over the next few weeks. We'll prepare a cover memo like we did last year, summarizing some of the information, and then put that sort of on top of the report itself. We do not typically edit reports that we have gotten from contractors, because that's what we pay them for, is to present us with a report, and then the board has the option to adopt the report at our October public meeting. We'll provide the cover memo probably within the next week or so, once we get a chance to review everything and have all the information back from PCSB as well. Yes. Is there anything I'm missing on the report part?
So you said leave this year.
If you can, yes. Appreciate it. I don't think so. Great. So the other item to talk about on the teacher attrition subject is the draft legislation.
Can I say something
Sure.
about?
Please.
So the way this will sort of roll out is, so we'll presumably adopt this at the October public meeting. And at that time, we'll have Mary Levy present.
Generally, no. We do not do that for reports like that. But if that's something that the board wants, we can ask Mary if she's available.
And I think that would be, and let me just say sort of the background is we've sort of gone back and forth about an event that we might do around this, and there's a new report out on teacher turnover by sort of a very well-known researcher in it, and we were sort of hoping that we'd be able to get her and have sort of a press briefing, do some stuff. It looks like schedule-wise, that's not going to happen on this timeline. It may happen in the future. So I guess my thought would be one way to do it is that this would in effect be our release of it, and it would make sense, I think, to have Mary there.
Okay.
So that, we're.
An abbreviated report.
And this will
Yeah.
happen at the October meeting?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm thinking, and,
I can ask Mary if she's available.
and then it becomes sort of our release.
One of the things to consider is, I think the report stands quite well on its own, and let's just think about what the public may perceive as holes in this. If there's a public back and forth on pieces that weren't part of the original scope of work, and I want to make sure we're not opening ourselves up to criticism on process or content on this, but having a sort of debate in the public in a way that might not be helpful, might not really be achieving the goals that we want, which is to really focus on the data that's in this.
It is a little unusual for an agency to call one of its vendors to a public meeting to sort of question them about the information that they provided that we paid for, right? So Mary Levy's contract is completed. We have paid her. It is done. So it seems a little odd for me to do that, but I also understand that it's a researcher.
What I was trying to get at was that there should be a public presentation of what's in here. So that we could talk about that if you have some ideas. But it seems to me it's a big report. People are looking forward to it. It's sort of from last year sort of established a kind of credibility, and I think we want to make sure that it gets the attention that it deserves.
But the fact that we have it is representation that we are accepting.
And that it is credible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that we need, because then it distracts from the report.
Can I ask, I've not seen it with the board, but I certainly didn't watch every meeting before I joined the board. Has there ever been a precedent where the board would use a period of a public meeting for moments of comment on a report that it had received? So for instance, instead of questioning panel witnesses, you might have the president give each member of the board 3 minutes to discuss the findings and any reflections or further questions they had based on the report.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean,
as a senior board member, I'd say that early on, as far as 7 years ago, each board member had 3 minutes at the end of the meeting to talk about issues that they wanted to just raise. So there certainly is precedent for that sort of conversation.
And it doesn't, and it shouldn't be at the end. From what Jessica's talking about, it ought to be something that addresses a major part of the meeting.
Sure. I mean, just in terms of general script, when
Our
once a
discussion
motion
on
is
that.
made and a second is made to adopt the report, it's open then for
That would be
discussion.
for discussion, okay.
So, yeah, so we could sort of-
Because that might be an alternate
Right.
way to
No,
make
no,
sure
no.
that we give this
And
attention.
everybody doesn't have to
Right.
respond.
But that it gave us a chance to share reflections on what we read and received.
No, I think that's a potentially good idea. And then I also think there are going to be a number of people that come to talk on it. So I think there will be some public comment on it before it even gets to us.
But it won't be public then.
Yeah,
It would be public by that point
Oh,
because
okay.
we publish all of our meeting materials on the Friday before the meeting. So it wouldn't be adopted by the board
Okay.
yet, but it would be in the
No,
public.
that's good, that's good.
Yeah, and we could certainly publicize.
Encourage the
Yes.
public.
And then, I like Jessica's idea, so hold that. In addition, would it make, if there was some person, like this person that we hope to get, does it make sense to have sort of an expert who could come in and sort of add to it with a different, you just don't think that?
I don't think for this particular thing, I think it's the board's stuff.
I mean, we have.
And then we can figure out if there's gonna be a separate event, we'll figure out a separate event.
Sure. We have also been notified that there is going to be significant public comment, folks that are going to come and talk about teacher retention and teacher attrition at the October 23rd meeting. So there will be more to discuss than just the report itself. And I know Fraser has to leave pretty quickly, so can we talk about the? Okay. So for the teacher for the statewide day warehouse legislation discussion draft. As requested, we did send that to a number of stakeholders and asked for their opinion. We got very limited feedback back so far. I've sent out another reminder asking for additional feedback, but I summarized the feedback that we've gotten so far into a sort of one-pager so you can see. Everything that's in italics is direct quote. So I didn't feel comfortable trying to modify someone else's comments, so those are all direct quotes, and I try to group them into two different areas. One about concerns about or comments on the data, types of data, and then the second part is comments on the timing or the burden. I think there is, frankly, a lot of wiggle room on both sides. There were people that were fine with the level of data. There were people that were concerned about the level of data. There were people that were concerned about the reporting procedures, and there were people that said that we should do it more often. So I think the board is probably at a space where it needs to decide on which way to go on all these types of things. I'll make the revisions, and then the board can also potentially bring that up at the October meeting as well for potential introduction with the council.
Could we also, when you do that, could you send us so that we could sort of give a yay or nay kind of thing so that we would come to the meeting with sort of a sense of where everybody is?
Yeah, Jessica, and then
So I want to raise two questions about the legislation. So one is, one of the questions I had asked of John Paul, and I still don't know the answer to because we left it, but I am curious about it, is some of the things we're asking OSSE to report in this legislation are already required in the law that established SLED. It may be in slightly different formats, right, like quarterly reporting versus the annual reporting, but they're already required to report on it. And I know that my understanding is that part of the reason some of the elements were included was because we do not see that data being collected. And one concern I have citywide, council does it, I think we may be doing it here, is when a law exists but is not being followed, do we pass another law or seek to pass another law that says the same thing and asks the same thing and create additional layers of regulation, or do we try to enforce or have oversight over the things that are meant to be collected already? So that's one question for me is I do think some of the things we're asking for in the legislation already should be collected, and if they are not being collected by OSSE, we should call that out, but I don't know that listing them again may not be the most effective way of getting it done. The second thing is I seem to be a magnet for people calling me to ask me about this legislation. So I received another phone call from someone who said, I hear there's another meeting with the Education Committee about your proposed legislation. And I did ask specifically in an email to the entire board for a listing of next steps. And this was the next step that I understood was happening, which was that there was to be feedback solicited. We all had the chance to ask for it. But again, the call I got was that there is a meeting on the calendar with Grasso.
So,
And I want to just clarify that.
Sure. So the committee director requested to talk with us in person rather than provide comments via email.
So it's just a
Which is
part of
part
the
of it.
process of the meeting with talking to stakeholders.
Okay, so they're just providing feedback. We're not sort of socializing the legislation with them in terms of asking them to support it or anything of that sort.
Not any more than we have with any other concept that I
Not per se. I mean, I think obviously we want people to support it. I mean, in fact, it gets introduced by the chair by statute. So it's not that we need sponsors. Obviously, I think part of talking to any people about this all the way through is we're looking for support. We want it to be something that people want. Are there things we can do to make it better?
And on that front, and it may just be procedural, a lack of procedural understanding on my part. At what point does the board vote on the language of the legislation that we would ask the council chairman to introduce?
So that's what I would like to have happen is that we have a draft at the October meeting that includes all this feedback that we put in front of us and we vote on at the October meeting. So we have the report, we have the legislation, and then we're in a position to go forward. So that's what I hope.
Thank you.
And to your point, Jessica, I mean, to me, and I'm not a legislative person, so John Paul is really taking very much the lead on how this reads and so on. But to me, the point is, our focus is the reporting, right? Our focus is that we want to have annual information on nutrition school by school. That's sort of our goal. And the one other thing I'll say, the reason that quarterly part is in there is really to get a handle on the long-term subs. It's not, and we've gone back and forth on this, and I don't think we're at a final place necessarily. The purpose of that is to just have the data so that people would have a sense of what was going on the permanent sub idea, because that's an issue in a lot of places. But for us, the goal is this: we want a report that shows the following things. And insofar as the data is redundant, then I mean, I personally like to work it out in a way that the legislation says we need a report that shall say this, and then it's up to other people to make that happen. Now, I don't know legislatively if that's appropriate or not appropriate, but I agree with you. The point is not to collect more; it's to have a report. That's our focus.
And to explain my thinking, I think what's happening, I think what we're trying to do is not pay Mary Levy annually to write us a report, but to have a governmental report that is published annually and is available from SLED. And my only point is, I think that some of the things that we're asking for are expected to be in SLED. May not be there right now. Totally acknowledge that.
I think they're not.
And we can't see SLED, right? Like there are different levels of access, and one has, the public reports that are currently available from OSSE SLED are really old. Like if you go to their SLED website and look at public reports, they are many years old at this point. So my sort of question is it that we want them to collect the data differently, and that's what the language of the legislation needs to say, or that we want them to publish the data that they're already collecting, or that we need them to own if they haven't collected the data they're supposed to?
I think it's the second. If anybody else thinks otherwise, this is now the point to say that. But to me, it's always been about
To publish the data they collect,
exactly.
and or collect that data so it can be published.
Right, and then I think it should be, it should be available the way they have a lot of other data available, so that people can go in and look and do more. But I think our focus is exactly as you're saying, is that
We don't have to do
we
this
shouldn't
every
have to
year.
be paying for this every year. Families ought to be able to get it. It ought to be public. So.
Joe Paul. You brought up a point that I've not been familiar with, which is that the committee chair would
the way that it works, it's actually in Article 4 of the Council's rules. It's rule, I just looked it up. A401B1. Independent agencies have the authority to introduce by the chairman at the request of the independent agency, which would be us. So it's similar to the mayor's introductory power, or not really power, but council members are the only ones that are allowed to introduce, but it's under rules that if an independent agency or the mayor asks for that, it is typically done as a matter of course.
So in addition to the data points that are in, that we're talking about, that I assume will be incorporated into this legislative draft that you and your team are going to pull together for us, I think we hit another roadblock in this process that we might want to address, even if we know it'll be struck, which is that agencies would be required to respond to requests from the board for data within a certain time period, like 90 days or something.
And ask that in the same piece of.
To put that language in and make council take it out, because one of the main things that we found early on when we were doing this is that agencies were not responding to us, and they don't have any need to, even though agencies are required to respond to neighborhood commissioners.
So I like that idea. I've always liked that idea. I think, without thinking about it a lot, I would suggest doing this two different pieces, since they can be introduced. And then we have sort of two separate bits. So let's think about that.
I don't agree with that. So don't.
Okay, well,
I'm thinking about it. So don't tell people that it's a sense of the board that we're going to do two separate pieces, because I'm not saying that.
Well,
I'm gonna
so
say
I
that.
guess that's what I'm asking. Think about it,
Yeah.
and others should think about it. If they have concerns or comments, they should say so, and we can sort of figure out if or where there's a consensus on that. I don't feel hard word on it, but so I'm gonna think about it also.
Yeah, as we're thinking about it, I'd be curious to hear sort of justifications for or rationale for and against a separate piece versus the same piece.
Can you speak to that at all? So if you're for having them be in the same piece, can you
I don't know yet. I want us to be able to think about it. This idea just came up 3 minutes ago, and so I think it's a little premature for the board to make decisions on which route we want to go and why.
Fair enough, but I do think we want to take a vote on at the public meeting.
That's okay.
So that's fine. So, all right. So let me ask: are there other thoughts, concerns, issues that people want to make sure get dealt with as this moves into sort of the next, what I'd say, penultimate draft? So that I think what we want to do is get out to people sort of the next good, near final draft that reflects people's views, and then we're.
Do you want to talk about fiscal at all?
Oh, yes, please. Yeah.
So I did talk to some folks related to getting some initial figures of the potential cost of the legislation. And what we've gotten back is the budget office was really helpful in talking to other agencies about potential draft and those types of things. And from their accounting, and not anything that I had anything to do with, the initial cost, the first year cost, would be somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000, and after that it would be somewhere between $130,000 and $150,000, mostly for the salary of a new employee at OSSE to manage this information. They estimated about somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000 per year in program costs.
And in terms of legislation, is that then something that we should make as sort of one more plank in the legislation that we propose, therefore, that there should be an additional person at OSSE based on this?
Because that's a budget. It's a budget item, and it would need to be in a different budget bill. It would need to be in a budget bill rather than in this this type of legislation.
And could you explain to all of us, including me, so let's say this gets introduced, let's say it gets passed, it would still need to be budgeted in a separate list.
Yeah. So the likelihood, just based on, so yes, if this was introduced October 24th and passed by the council November 1st, right? Which won't happen because of the timing. But if it were to happen, then it goes to Congress for review, which is usually between 90 days and 6 months, and then it becomes law. But there's always a provision in the statute, and the draft actually has this, that it will become effective upon inclusion in a budget bill. And the next budget bill would then be the FY 2021 budget.
So, I am going to make an assumption here, but if the fiscal impact suggests that there's a need for an additional staff person at OSSE, that means this data isn't being pulled, even if the SLED legislation says it's supposed to be. So that's an interesting sort of statement on the fact that OSSE has been required under SLED legislation to request this annual data. So either it's that they're not, or that the way we formatted the language about the requesting suggests that the person who currently deals with any data collected on teachers would not have room in their schedule in order to do these multiple changes. So I wonder if there's a cause for us to investigate any further to understand whether it's the changes in the way we're requesting the data or it's that the data doesn't exist.
We've raised this with OSSE, and I think that's a useful particular way to do one more follow-up on it, to sort of see if there, maybe part of what we had said was, is there a way that we can frame this that would have you be very supportive? Because I would not say very supportive, and maybe that's why. But part of it is we want to provide whatever staff and funding. So I think that's worth following up on.
I should also note that we did provide to OSSE for comments directly, and they said that they would prefer to comment during the regular order. So once it's introduced, then they will be probably testifying around.
Any other? So let me just ask people. You're going to think on this specific thing and sort of help us all think.
I think everyone should think on it.
Yeah. But you're and others, we've had this out for a while. If there's other things, you've got the comments. What else concerns you, so that we can really try to have a draft out next week or within next week. I would say.
And I can work on the potential additional language that Jack suggested, and others. We already have most of it done already.
Yeah, we certainly want to think about what the content is and why that's important legislatively, or why it should be codified. But we should also think about this from a process standpoint, and I think that's a place where a lot of us don't normally go when we're thinking. But I think the requirement of responsiveness from our partner education agencies is really critical for us to be successful and to really understand policies that we're approving and the dialogue that we're engaged in.
Can you clarify what it is we are thinking about in terms of is the separate versus having it in one? Because it's not clear to me like what I'm supposed to do.
Well, I think Jack will help us sort of play out the arguments in either direction. So which we will sort of have, I guess, by email, but you should think also about any other things.
So the current, before 10 minutes ago, the idea was to have legislation that required certain reporting of teacher and principal data. My thought is yes, but in addition, we had a hard time creating this report, and this is the report we want every year, and we want us to report every year. But we had a problem getting this report together because we, as an elected body, don't have the authority to request information that would need to be responded to appropriately by other education agencies. And that's been problematic for the entire 7 years I've been on the board.
And so the language would be, I guess I'm not understanding.
So what?
So yes, I agree that.
What ANC commissioners have, what ANCs have by statute, is that city agencies, district agencies, must respond to an ANC request for information or comment within a set period of time, and when an ANC passes a resolution, an agency needs to give that resolution quote unquote great weight. You're a commissioner. No, you're a commissioner.
No, but I worked at the deputy mayor's office and heard that term from commissioners a lot.
Yeah, and so I just feel like if ANC's already get that privilege, why would we be denied that same
So we're
privilege?
requesting that from.
Well, I think, I think what I'm understanding in your question is the difference between putting it in this legislation versus putting it in a separate piece. And to Jack's point about it being process, is the state board has never proposed legislation in this manner previously. So do we come out with two requests?
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, would you present this one and then this one? Or do we put that request in this one to say, we think that the state should be collecting this data and annually reporting on it? Also, by the way, we would like you to be responsive to all requests that we make of
We need a
agencies.
mechanism.
Exactly.
Right.
And so by including it in there, to Jack's point, it either stays in, where the council takes it out as part of the markup, but it gets on the record in our first ask that this is something we care about.
Some part of it's optics, and part of it's, you know, just problem. Yeah, practical.
Yeah, thank you. And so at some point we'll hear why we choose.
Yeah, it was my off the top, and I think about it. I don't have any.
Promise to be quiet after this, but I'm going to raise one more concern just about the language. The limited feedback we got, only one piece of feedback in my quick scan asks for, if you're going to ask, here's another thing I want you to ask for. Everything else says, either the way you're asking for it seems burdensome, or we already collect a lot of data and we can tell you that quarterly actually isn't going to tell you the story you want, or so this feedback generally seems to be concerned about the requests we're making and or unsupportive, with only one comment that seems to ask for more. And then if OSSE is also at least not enthusiastically supportive, I just want our entire board to be considering what that may mean for us making this ask.
I agree, but I guess what I would say is, I think we know that our agencies have not been eager to put out this data on teacher turnover, which is why it was left to the state board to do it. So it doesn't surprise me that people have reasons and are pushing back against it, but I think.
I just want us to give it due consideration. They're not all like, hey, we hate this and it's stupid.
Right.
They've given sort of rational.
Well, I think two of them that
critiques.
I think we do want to look at are, one, we have no interest in redundant data. It really isn't. We just want this reported. If you already have it, even, that's, and I think partly we've tried to do that. We can try to do it a little bit more. I also think it's part of what would happen in the legislative process. So I think we want to be clear that our goal is to have a clear report, not to make extra work that's not necessary. Do our best to get that right up front, and also be open to shifts in that. The one that does strike me is this quarterly data, which I had raised myself. It was the question that I've raised at various stages, and I think I certainly would be very open to trying to find other ways that there would be some record, some ability to know where and how many, to what extent kids are getting long-term subs, because I would say at this point might be one of my largest complaints.
So, Jessica, to your point about potential redundancies, I think Ruth's point on annual versus quarterly data does matter sometimes. If there are pieces that are required to be reported on SLED or some similar mechanism that haven't been, our transmittal letter could enumerate some of these pieces and ensure that we're being very clear on these are already required but aren't being publicly,
So
they
this
aren't
should be part
available
of
publicly.
the cover letter, the
Correct,
transmittal,
the
so
transmittal.
it's not that we have to address it in the legislation, but.
We wouldn't necessarily need to, but we could be very clear in the transmittal letter that we would be open to additional language, legislative or otherwise, to compel agencies to follow the law as it's written, or as we'd like it to be written. I think the transmittal letter can include a lot of information and could set a really good precedent for how we frame legislation when we send it up, rather than sending us just a piece without sufficient context. And I'm sure the chairman and his committee staff all understand the context, but this would be something where the public would understand our context as well.
So I think that sounds great. And one thing I would urge if we can pull it off, John Paul's have both of those things available to go out to people by the middle of next week so that we can sort of collect all of that input and ideally, come here ready to vote on this with all of that stuff. All right, so obviously I can't really say forever hope and peace because you're independent people who are going to read and do and say, but do try everybody to sort of take a final look, think about anything that should be on our minds that's of a concern that we have organized. All right, it is late. Let's see. John Paul, do you want, let's see. I think the teacher retention report we've done.
Sure.
The research is really what we're doing on the around the SOWs. I'm going to say a couple of things in my leadership report on a couple of these. Do you want to do a well-rounded report? Do you want to do a social studies report?
I'll happily just share what we talked about with the committee chairs. Do it. Yep. Okay. The Social Studies Standards Committee. We had a brief conversation earlier today among the various chairpersons of committees to talk about scheduling meetings going forward. So I will be reaching out to all of the members of the Social Studies Committee and CCing all other board members about the dates on which I'm hoping to schedule the next 2 meetings of the Social Studies Standards Committee before the end of this calendar year. One will be after an upcoming meeting with OSSE, which is happening on October 21st, and before the public session in November, when we're hoping to have a panel of social studies people come and speak. And the content of that meeting, I hope, will focus on who do we want to speak, how will we do the outreach, what kind of things are we hoping to ask them to speak on with relation to the standards. The second meeting I'd like to propose will happen after that November public session, but before the end of the calendar year, to discuss the next steps for the Social Studies Standards Committee, including talking about establishing an advisory committee, discussing other plans for how we'll proceed once we hopefully have a additional FTE who will help the state board with any standards related work. And so that's the current plan for social studies. I will say I've continued to have conversations with LEAs to continue to generate buy-in and interest in supporting a review and potential revision of the social studies standards. So I met with DC Public Schools, with folks from Teaching and Learning, and they're excited, as well as understandably nervous as an LEA that recently established curriculum and assessments based on the current standards, but they understand the need for review of standards that are 13 years old and are looking forward to being part of it. I've also been talking with a number of constituents who are social studies teachers in Ward 6, I should say constituents in Ward 6 who are social studies teachers, who had a lot of really good thoughts that I'll bring to the committee meeting about ways we think about what kinds of things we might do in a standards revision to make sure we're really improving on standards rather than simply changing.
And one thing I just want to throw out is we've talked about in the committee at various points the idea that I think if we all had our druthers, we would reopen these in a more limited way. Partly, and I think about it because we think of these LEAs that have brand new curriculum, they have all the stuff that they've invested in, that there are reasons to try to identify the key things that we need to strengthen, improve, fix, change. And insofar as there's a consensus on that, I think that's a plus. Obviously, people are going to raise what people want to raise, but
yeah, I mean, I would say I've heard that loudly and clearly from you, that there's a fear of opening them widely.
yeah, I think it was sort of on the committee. Maybe I read wrong, but that was my
I don't share that feeling, so I will say it wasn't 100% of the committee.
Okay.
I think we all agree on the committee that there are specific areas, like civics, like the early grades, that we know and we have heard need attention. But the more I talk with people, the more I am getting interesting feedback around, for instance, DC social studies standards are well regarded for having a tremendous amount of content that is highly inclusive, right? So where there are a number of different organizations that rate standards on various inclusiveness categories, and we, for instance, have pretty high scores on women's history. We include a lot of women in our standards, and that's fantastic. On the other hand, it can lead to standards that are so extensive that LEAs or teachers pick and choose power standards to focus on, which may limit students' access and exposure to the entirety of the body of the standards. So to me, that may be a harder thing to narrowly focus on early grades or civics, but maybe a broader question that folks take up in the discussion of the standards. That how do you balance the wide coverage with potential for limitation of kids getting exposed?
I think Laura Keeps raised this a couple of months ago, which is she stopped teaching world history because it's European history, it's not world history.
And the woman I got the chance to speak with today is a former DC social studies teacher. She currently teaches in an independent school. But she was sharing with me that one of the things she's able to do in her new school, in an independent school, is to treat world history in a very sort of flipped capacity. So to look at current events that are present, and so she's headed back to school next week. She's been on maternity leave and is going to talk about Ukraine and the current issues with Russian involvement in the United States, but use that to lead into the history of Russia, the various pieces that are part of the world history curriculum, starting from a place of current events and really backing into how do we understand that in light of the history. That's something she felt like she couldn't do in her DC school, given the design of the standards, but something that she has the freedom to do now. So I think there's a lot of really interesting things that folks are bringing up that I would not have thought of.
So with the social studies standards, are we also working towards making it like you were talking about, like the whole Ukraine, Russia, that's a more well-rounded approach to social studies. So are we still trying to like expand it to where you're not learning the same thing essentially over and over, like the presidents, World War I, World War II, Industrial Revolution, the same thing, kind of expanding it to like what has happened in like other countries and how has America affected, like to give students a perspective like what has America done. It's always like what people did to America, but to give a broader perspective of what has America done to other countries, it can give students a different perspective on like why certain countries are the way they are now and certain things like that.
So Deja's actually brought up a really important point that I forgot to mention in the social studies update, which is that at the good suggestion of our executive director, I'd like to ask if I can come to the student advisory committee to talk with them about recommendations for how the social studies standards committee might incorporate things you all were thinking about, like the point you just made, so that I can bring that to our next committee meeting. With them, I'll connect you guys on email and figure out when I can come speak.
Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you for bringing that up.
To add one more thing about what you said, the best like history or social studies teacher I ever had, who recently left because she went to Japan. But I really liked her as a teacher because like every class she somehow incorporated like the current events of today. And we had like current event worksheets we'd have to fill out every Friday, and like because of that, we find a way to relate it to like what you're learning. So she was like a U.S. government teacher. So it was really interesting to just like stay up to date with what's happening in the news, and also applying that to like our knowledge of like the U.S. history or U.S. government.
Awesome. We're doing that now too in my U.S. government class. We're looking at the Constitution and how it relates to life now, and if we can make any changes to it, which is impossible, but if we could, what would we make changes to it? And it also shows us like why the democracy is set up the way it is now, and that's based on the Constitution. And I like having to learn about history, but then make it relevant to the time that I'm living in. Because to just learn about something that happened before I got here, it's like, okay, that was great, but why do I need to know this?
Yeah, I also think, I mean, again, to the point of how we approach the revision of the standards, I think the points you made are really good ones. Sometimes we adults think about how do we make it relatable to students' lives, but we maybe stop there and don't think about the complex ways you are already describing. The fact that like making it relevant to your lives doesn't mean not teaching you history. It means helping find the entry points that keep you deeply engaged and make you think critically and frankly make far smarter conclusions and ask better questions. Yes. I did teenagers so much.
I was just going to say, just to add to this conversation, but I was into the history and that development, so that you're getting how it's related to where we are today in our life. So it's very interesting to see the split, and that's good, and I'm glad that they're making those connections.
I mean, the best way to teach somebody is to relate it to them and make it about them because they like themselves.
Okay. Do you want to give a?
Just really brief, I guess. We were on hold, I think, the last time I reported back. And so since then, we've had an opportunity, John Paul and Ruth and I, to speak with Matt. What's his name? Yes. At DCPS. And so we talked about all of the research, but specifically about, being able to access schools, teachers. And so we're waiting to hear back from them, basically. So we're still on hold, but there's been a little progress in the right direction. And tomorrow, Ruth and I are going to meet with the Johns Hopkins folks about they're doing already in the planning phases, I believe, of a project they're doing with DCPS, and so we are exploring the possibility of teaming with them. And what they are doing is using a tool that's a curriculum mapping tool to sort of look at, the degree to which, I don't even know if that's the right language, actually, but it's showing how much emphasis is being placed on various subject areas, and I think I won't say more right now. But anyway, it's an interesting tool that possibly could really help us with this inquiry into well-rounded education. So I have kind of put on hold. I know I had sent out an email about reaching out to principals to start focus groups, but after speaking with Matt, he suggested that he needs to think about it and talk to his people, and was open to sort of being the one to send out that request, which would be great, right? Because that's an official request. So that's where we are with that. And I had also, I think, last time I saw you, I thought of that as well. So glad that came up. That we, of course, would love to speak with students about your perspectives on well-rounded education. And so that is something we cannot do sooner than later. So I'd like to also set up a time to talk and speak. I think that's it, right?
Yeah. Let me give a leadership report and then the executive director. Okay.
I actually, if you don't mind, Deja may have to leave fairly soon. Do you mind if she gives a quick update on her work on Monday?
Oh yeah, so on Monday I went to the mental health. Was it a session? It was based off of an initiative to bring outside clinicians into public schools. So like I have a social worker and I worked with her like since freshman year, and so I spoke on like how I went through like a really bad depression, and because of her, I'm still here, and it's very important to like for this initiative to go through and become, I don't know if it's becoming a law or whatever initiative it is. I was just advocating for it because if I didn't have the services I had at my school, I probably wouldn't be here now. So it was really beneficial. There was former Mayor Vincent Gray was there, and other Congress people as well as the superintendent. She was there, and I feel like I made a good impact, and I hope that it continues, like the momentum that it has now. I hope that it continues.
I want to note that she's being a little modest about the impact. She got a standing ovation for her impromptu remarks that she made, and I've gotten multiple emails from feedback from people who were in the room that were incredibly grateful for her to be there. So thank you.
Is this something we can see? Was it recorded?
I think it
It's
is.
an audio recording, I think, though.
It was at the National Press Club, so
But
they
one thing I would suggest is either on your own or working with staff is to turn that into an op-ed. We did that last year, and it was some of the retention stuff, and it could be a great way to get the word out more broadly.
That's great.
And you can just
Yeah, we'd be happy to
build
work
it
together.
right off of the
It's an op-ed from
like a kind of a an opinion piece.
Oh, okay.
Like not by the
as an
editors, but like
opinion.
other people, like a column.
Got it. I
Have your name.
to work on that. I gotta add that to my list.
And maybe John Paul can touch base with you and just sort of see if or how it would be helpful to have this there. All right. Okay, let me just, a couple things I want to say in the leadership report. The main thing actually has been picked up by different people, which is there's actually been a lot of movement in this past period with various of our partners on various projects that we've adopted. So, for example, we've had a big issue with how can we reach all the departed teachers. For our survey, PCSB has now sent out a letter to all the principals, so that's happening. DCPS is considering it. As Emily said, we sat down with their government relations person to sort of go through a whole set of issues that we're trying to work through. And it was a very nice tone. I mean, I think on the retention study, they're sort of less interested, but on these other studies, what we're calling the standards project, there's a lot of interest in, and the curriculum project, there's a lot of interest in. And so we're going to be sitting down, we now have sort of a go-ahead to sit down with various people in there to try to make these things go forward. And with OSSE, Jessica's going to be coming, so we're going to have to our monthly meeting with OSSE in October, so we'll sort of raise it with them, but we'll sort of have a more detailed conversation. Marcus and I had a conversation with Chairman Mendelson, and just sort of following up on sort of the retention stuff, and he's very interested in the retention. I don't know what all that will mean in terms of our legislation, but he's very interested in the issue. He's very interested in our reports and in making it an issue, and possibly having council do some hearings on it. So we'll sort of see how that plays out, but that was certainly nice. And then, as somebody raised, Fraser and I and John Paul, I think, are scheduled to meet with David Russell's office tomorrow. So that's about the retention legislation. So quickly, let me raise one other issue that people should just think about. And again, a few of us talked about this before, is the homicide crisis in DC, especially as it is affecting our youth, is just terrible. It's devastating, and I know it's on everybody's minds, and it's very hard to know what to do. We all see stuff on Twitter and Facebook all the time, and I mean, what do? You don't like it? I mean, what can we do to sort of keep it, sort of add our voice to this idea that this needs to be dealt with? And this is still in process, but one thing that we've talked about is maybe that one of the issues, and it's not the only issue, but one issue is that there was a set of things that DC was doing around this, and Congress prevented us from doing it. And one possibility is to sort of every Monday or so to put out kind of a weekly tweet or a Facebook post that just sort of, not maybe saying the names, but indicating, there were some students who were killed or assaulted or injured over the weekend. Here's where they live, or here's where they go to school, and just to sort of keep attention on it, to sort of focus on it, and possibly indicate the kinds of things that Congress has not allowed us to do, that we might even then tweet to Congress. So we're thinking about things and open to other thoughts on it. I mean, I think we don't.
What do you mean?
The state board. I mean, I don't think we as the state board have the expertise, the authority, or anything.
Well, you said that we've been talking about it. This is the first I've heard of it.
Oh yeah, I had talked about it to John Paul, and then earlier when we had the committee chairs meeting, as we were walking out, I raised it. This is really the first conversation point. So
is there research or articles about how to frame this sort of discussion to be more impactful, or is it just something you want to do? Just doing something is important, but I want to do something that's actually going to have an outcome that is what we intended to.
Well, that's what we were grappling with
Fraser raised that.
And so I think that's the big question, is, the purpose is not just to make ourselves better.
Right.
Right.
So
So I think that's when we came to this idea of maybe actually calling out Congress, on preventing DC from being able to actually move forward with some of the legislation or initiatives that would maybe, I don't know.
When you're referring to Congress, does it have to pass the House and Senate, or is there like a committee, like House members and Senate members? How does that work when, like?
Who wants to answer that? It's not me.
For
John Paul actually worked there, so I'll.
That's how democracy.
For like, if like you said, you were trying to pass something, but Congress shut it down, was it like?
Yeah, so it depends on who's in control of the bodies, which party are in control. But generally, everything has to pass the House and the Senate. It usually has to go through a committee structure. For DC legislation, it's a little bit different because it's a passive approval process. So the only way Congress can overturn a DC law would be to pass what's called a resolution of disapproval. So then the resolution of disapproval goes through the House, the Senate, and has to be signed by the President.
But what Congress normally does, they also have the power to purse over DC, and so what Congress frequently does is it will put provisions into annual appropriation bills or funding bills that say that DC must do this or can't do that.
Yeah.
And that's frequently, like marijuana legalization, for instance. Congress said in its appropriation bills, DC can't do that. We can't have personal use sales.
Or the other one that was interesting too, exactly what you're talking about. They said that we couldn't spend any of our money on the regulation of it either. So, and the way that was interpreted is the DC Council was not permitted to have a hearing on regulations, and the mayor was not allowed to start working on regulations because that would be expending money in course of salaries or other types of things on the development of those regulations.
And it's so counterintuitive because in the 3 states that have had a recreational program that's well regulated, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, youth consumption has decreased because there's no black market anymore. So we don't have any regulatory structure here. So there's a huge black market, and so we're seeing in a lot of our schools, and I'm sure you're seeing among your peers, that these drugs are readily available. It's because there's
Get it right after school.
Yeah.
Just be like, hey, I'm meeting up with my mans, and that's a whole drug deal right there. It's not accessible. It's very, and then now that it's like legal, it's grown everywhere. Like in my grandmother's neighborhood, they just readily it's just out there. I'm like,
yeah, it's the worst
And,
I've ever seen.
and it's always hot topics that Congress takes action on these kinds of things. So marijuana
Hot topics,
legalization,
especially in their districts.
guns.
I mean, like I guess I'm okay with like the marijuana legalization because of the whole like the high incarceration rate of African Americans. It's just the access that teens have. I mean, it's not as bad as like I guess vaping or like cocaine, but it's still detrimental to the body. But teenagers don't care, and life is hard, and it's like progressively each year life is getting more harder, and so teens are finding ways to kind of just detox, and it's not the best way, but it's one way. I mean, that's just the sad reality. It's not going to stop. There's nothing. I'm not saying there's nothing, but it's pretty well established.
I will say that today I was with Moms Demand Action at the DC Council for lobbying council members, and I went in my personal capacity, and I went to Robert White's office with Ward 6 folks, and he said something very similar to what Deja just shared, which is the notion that there's a certain degree of hopelessness in a lot of our communities, and this hopelessness is what we need to be addressing. So I hear everything, and I share the concern that we find a way to play a role in making sure that council and the mayor and call out Congress and we back up our congresswoman, but I think we've got to think about how we do that in a way that feels active, in a way that doesn't re-traumatize any of our kids or our families. I don't have a good answer yet. I promised I would think about it in the elevator, and I did, but I don't have any answers.
No, I mean, it takes some thought, so I wanted to put it on the table for people to think about, and that includes everybody.
Can I just interrupt
Yeah.
to that? Because Stanton Elementary School is right there where Kayla got shot. On the court, we just say, wham, bam, thank you, man, issue, move them down the block or whatever. It's something that will take a lot of time, initiative, and resources.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what it's
Now
a
that we
tremendous,
can't do it,
huge, right, it's a tremendous, huge issue, and it's not one that we're positioned to have authority to sort of directly deal with. The question is there something that we can do to, I'm using the terms, just sort of keep forcing the attention to, there might be a better phrase, but, so what is it that we could do? It's not, we're not experts on it, we're not in policy on it, so anyway, that's, but
That's
things about,
I mean, I'm just thinking it doesn't have to be only one thing. I mean,
Right.
so if we did do something, I mean, for some reason, what keeps coming to my mind is the taxation without representation. That is a statement that is everywhere.
Yep.
This has much more immediate urgency, and so I think maybe we could think of it as that. It's advocacy in the form of keeping it present, but with a target, right? With Congress's target, maybe getting other people, asking others to retweet it, or whatever, to share it in some form. But I also like Karen's idea, which is taking a more, I don't know, like a more active
Cities like,
role of like
getting more
actually,
people involved.
yeah.
I mean, maybe combining it with like the teen suicide rate with homicide, with the like maybe not necessarily gentrification, but kind of gentrification, because main thing is like the housing market is just unlivable for a lot of people. So it's putting more stress on families to like, especially if they go to a DC school and then it's like if we go to Maryland, like you can, well, not in Maryland really, but it's a little bit easier in Maryland. But it's like if you go to Maryland now, you're risking, being able to stay in a DC school, which DC schools are really good compared to Maryland. Well, in my opinion, they're better than Maryland for the most part. So it's hard to be like, well, let's just move to Maryland if you're in a really good school. So I mean, combining it with a whole bunch of like hot topics, and I guess like the top 3 hot topics, and making that kind of, I guess, like a citywide initiative could possibly convince Congress. Congress is a mess right now, so I don't
all right, any final thoughts? Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Executive Director's report, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I'll go nice and quick. So I just wanted to let everyone know that we are still working to hire our public affairs specialist position, and hopefully I'll have a better update from that from DCHR soon. I hoped to get it today, but I have not gotten it yet, so I can't share any additional information about that. And I did want to remind everyone that our October meeting is on the 23rd, not on the 17th, because a number of us will be in Omaha for the National Association of State Board of Education's conference. So that's it.
There's nothing on the 7th.
There's nothing on the 17th.
All right, I'm hereby, no further business, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it, and this working session of the BC State Board of Education is adjourned.
Thanks, Ashley.
Bye,
Ashley.
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 I'm going to come back to talk to you about the meeting. So,